So, to kick us off this morning, Matt Morgan, who spoke yesterday, is going to come back on the stage and talk to us a bit about what animals can teach us. Now, my wife is Kenyan, and so I've been taken to the Masai Mara many times. Now, I told her about a lion related incident where I injured myself, and she said, "No, the animal did nothing to you. You just fell over because you're an idiot." So, animals taught me that I was an idiot, but I did fall over trying to take a picture of a lion and hurt myself. But I will give you Matt.
So I want to share a secret with you this morning. I'm feeling a bit vulnerable, a little bit delicate at the edges. It's a great time to share a secret, and that secret is I like fairy tales. Sorry. And I like fairy tales because I didn't read a fiction book until I was in my 30s, until my daughter was born. And she loved fairy tales. That was our kind of bedtime night routine. And her favorite being Kissing the Frog, or the Frog King, or the Iron King, as it might be called. But being a scientist and a data person and a geek, I wanted to know the truth of that fairy tale. It was the Disney version I was reading to her every night. So I foolishly ordered the Brothers Grimm original fairy tale book. You can see what's coming. She settled down one evening. She was really cozy. The lights were dimmed, and I started reading. And then I got to the critical paragraph where the princess picked up the frog, looked at the frog, and said, "You are a disgusting creature. I hate you. You are ugly." Threw the frog against the wall, and the frog was dead. Now, not the best way to go to sleep, to be honest, and she doesn't like fairy tales ever since. But today I'm going to talk to you about another creature who was thrown against the wall and left for dead. And that other creature is this guy, a guy called Ivan, who I met in the intensive care unit. And he's going to be our story to talk to us about how understanding the lives of animals can help treat humans, help human medicine, especially in circulation. Now, when I first met Ivan, he looked a bit like this. But we knew what to do. We were feeling really clever. We work in a neurocritical care. We used the theories of Monroe and Kelly and Lundberg from Scotland and other places in the last 50 to 100 years. We know all about CPP now. We knew about different ties. We knew about hypertonic saline. We felt very clever. But we only knew that really for the last 50 years. Before that, neurocritical care was a very different beast. But there is somebody who knew all of those theories, all of those techniques long before us. In fact, not for 50 years or 100 years, but for millions of years. And that was Misha. This is Misha, the Rothschild giraffe that I met in Perth Zoo back in the 2000s. She also featured on many posters on the walls. I don't know if anyone here had this poster on her wall. She's pictured with her calf, Isabella. She sadly died in 2016 of natural causes. But the reason Misha knows all about CPP is because of that crazy long neck. Every day she has an issue with cerebral perfusion. And she does all of the things that we did to Ivan in the intensive care unit, all of the things you do to people with critical trauma. And the way she does that is she has the highest blood pressure of all land mammals. Her systolic is around 300 millimeters of mercury. But Misha doesn't have a critical care bed. She doesn't have a bank full of syringes. She doesn't have noradrenaline to achieve that, which is what we used for Ivan. She has something else. Now, yesterday in the workshop, we were hoping to do some of these scans, but the doorway was a little bit too low. We couldn't get Misha in. But if you managed to do an echo on a giraffe, you'd need a ladder for a start. But it would look a bit like this, which is how most of my echoes look, very grainy, and I can't work out what it means. So if you cheat and look at a heart in prosection, you would think that this person would have died of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but they hadn't. This is a normal heart for a normal giraffe. This is how it achieves that 300 millimeters of mercury every day. But the crazy thing is, giraffes develop no heart disease. They get no subendocardial ischemia. And why is that? We don't know. And we don't know because we don't ask. And we don't ask because it's a giraffe. You know, why are you talking about giraffes? That's weird. We're humans. We are these special, different species, not like any others. And of course, that's nonsense. And so part of the talk today, which is based on a book I've written called One Medicine, which is out this year actually, is about bringing those species together into one medicine in order to improve care, medicine, and health for both species actually. So we got through those critical days with Ivan. We managed to manage his CPP using techniques from the giraffe, but then we had a different problem. And that's because Ivan was asthmatic and he'd probably developed a ventilator-associated pneumonia. We were really struggling to ventilate him properly. He was becoming more and more hypoxic. And that's when Misha can help us again, actually. In fact, there was a fairly crazy doctor who worked in London, who in his time off would go to London Zoo and dissect the animals that had died naturally. This is him holding up a giraffe's trachea. He also spent, as you do, he spent quite a lot of time as well in the Amazon with various native tribes. And when he first went there, they handed him a blowpipe of a specific size, different from the size of other people's blowpipes. And he asked about this. And he said, oh, well, it's because if we give you a blowpipe that's too big, when you blow through it, the dart won't come out the end very fast. And it was all based on height. It was all based on dead space. And so that gave him the idea, Philip Jones, who this is, to look at dead space issues in other creatures. Now, the dead space in a giraffe is a problem. But again, the giraffe knows how to set a ventilator. What does it do? It breathes at a very high tidal volume, about 20 to 30 mils per kilo, with a very low respiratory rate to minimize dead space, the exact same way that we ventilated Ivan in those critical days. But despite those things were getting trickier. And this was still a few years ago where we had one of these crazy dangerous machines one of you may have read about in the history books. We've actually still got an oscillator in Cardiff, although it's in a cupboard that nobody can find the key for, which is probably for the best. But we actually oscillated Ivan. And again, we felt very clever. It's been around since the 70s. What a crazy technology. And I went home that night after Ivan was on the oscillator. I saw my family, I saw my daughter who was still crying, and I saw my dog. And I thought, yeah, it's not new at all. My dog's been doing this for millions of years. In fact, the frequency we set on the oscillator was the same frequency as a dog pant. And some of the molecular mixing and some of the science based around oscillation is exactly the same in terms of how dogs pant. Now, I don't know if there's any fans of the Journal of Amphibian Physiology in the room. Guy at the back, yeah. July 2023, my favourite edition. Yep, yours too. And that's because it talks about this creature. And this creature was the next step in managing Ivan's hypoxia, because he was getting worse and worse every day. And that's really the title of the talk, How Kissing a Frog Can Save Your Life, is because until 1952, when that little girl Vivi developed polio, humans had never used positive pressure ventilation really before. Surely there's no animals that use positive pressure ventilation, is there? And the truth is, yes, there is. Frogs routinely breathe using positive pressure ventilation. They blow out their buccal cavity, they squeeze that buccal cavity, and that causes positive pressure ventilation. And guess how many mils per kilo they breathe? 6 mils per kilo. So way before the ARDS paper, we could have just asked a frog. But in fact, the Bedouin spiny tail lizard does something else rather crazy. Something that, again, we've only thought about in the last few decades. Something you've all done in this conference. You've all breathed in to peep high. You've all oscillated at the top when you've laughed, when you've cried, and you've all expired. You've all used APRV. And this is the pressure trace of a Bedouin spiny tail lizard breathing in the desert using APRV. Now, things got even worse for Ivan. He became more and more hypoxic, and we thought about other techniques and maybe even referring him to ECMO specialists in London. Now, survival during hypoxia and during even cardiac arrest is something that's new to humans relatively. This is a picture of a guy called Casper, who was one of 7 children who died when their dragon boat collapsed in a frozen lake just outside of Copenhagen. That was their school PE trip, very different from mine in Wales. Just as cold in Wales, but a bit wetter. And it's also the case that all 7 children who had no heartbeat for hours, up to 6 hours, all of them survived actually. And they survived, of course, thanks to that extreme cold and thanks to a team in Copenhagen using ECMO. But again, this isn't a relatively new concept. Where I live in Cardiff, this is the headland around Penarth, a small village outside of Cardiff. And this is the Terra Nova, where Cook set sail. But they set sail not to discover new places only, but also new creatures. And one of the new creatures they discovered on their expedition was this crazy thing, the ice fish. The ice fish lives at the bottom of the Antarctic sea shelf. It's transparent because although it can produce hemoglobin, it doesn't bother. Hence, it's transparent. And it doesn't bother because of the same reason your beer last night tasted so good. It was cold, and so gas solubility was high, and it was initially under pressure before it came out, and hence gas solubility was high. So the ice fish purely survives on dissolved oxygen because of those factors. In fact, there's some other lessons from tropical fish we can learn. If you talk to tropical fish enthusiasts, which I do, it's the kind of life I lead, this is how they routinely transport fish internationally using methylene blue. And that's because it helps with oxygen delivery, as well as being a fairly powerful fungicide, actually. Now, there is a trigger warning on the next slide. It's not sad, but it's quite disturbing, and it does involve a naked person. And I'm afraid that naked person is me. My bottom doesn't really look like this. And this was because I went to a small Scottish island just south of Skye called Elan Shonna, where Peter Pan was written, bizarrely. It's owned by Richard Branson's sister. And I went there to desperately try and finish writing this book when COVID finally settled down. But one reason I went there was to take all my clothes off, cover myself in honey, and stand outside at dusk. Because I wanted to get bitten. I wanted to get bitten by midges. And I did get bitten by midges. I got bitten by hundreds of midges. But the weird thing about that was the fact that it didn't hurt. It was excruciating an hour later, but at the time, I didn't even feel them. And that's because midges and mosquitoes are better at doing lines than you all. They use a Seldinger technique. They vibrate their needle at about 20,000 kilohertz, the same frequency as a TENS machine, which is what we use in pregnancy. They use gate theory of pain to make sure it doesn't hurt. They spit anticoagulant called Draculin in order to prevent clotting within the needle. They have a heat-seeking tip, so they use ultrasound. And overall, they are better at doing lines and taking blood than all of us. There are now researchers in the UK and Japan using some of this needle technology to try to develop pain-free injections, pain-free vaccinations, and pain-free glucose monitoring. So going from the smallest creature to one of the biggest, if I had a whale's heart here, it would fill most of the area in front of us. It's about the size of a grand piano. And the crazy thing about that is despite the variation in size between species of their heart, the basic techniques of conduction we thought were the same. But there's a big problem there. We know that the conduction speed is dependent on the fiber length. And in humans, from atria to ventricles, that's about 0.5 centimeter. In a whale, it's about 0.5 meter. And that would mean their heart shouldn't work. It shouldn't beat. It would be too slow. It just wouldn't function. So a fairly crazy cardiologist that you've probably heard of, Hans Wellen, from Wellen syndrome, was obsessed with the whale's heart, and he wanted to take a whale's ECG. Now, getting an ECG in a human in ICU is hard enough. So their team decided to travel to South America with using suckers on the end of harpoons to try to do a whale ECG. But there was a problem with that. They went in mating season. And if you don't remember anything from this talk, it's that a whale's penis is called a Pink Floyd. That's all I want you to remember. Um, I don't know what came first, the penis or the band. Letters on a postcard. But yeah, so they went in mating season. Whales also mate in threes. So not a good time to do an ECG in summary. And in fact, Hans Weller nearly died during that trip. But they returned outside of mating season, probably a better time to go. And they did manage to get a whale's ECG, which embarrassingly is better than most of the ECGs I see from our patients, actually. And just to give you a flavour of how they actually did that, a modern team recreated this feat just a few years ago, and you should be able to hear in the background the actual sound of a whale's heart whilst they did this as well. So yeah, this is them on their speedboat with a sucker on the end of a harpoon attaching to the dorsal surface of a whale, and that actually gave them sound waves, which they then interpreted into this heartbeat. And what that showed, the point of all this, is that despite being a factor of 10 longer in terms of the fibre length, the PR interval in a whale is actually only double that of a human. And how is that possible? Well, we now know how it's possible, and it's possible because of fractal conduction, and that's now an essential component of how ablation therapy in EP works. So going all the way from doing an ECG of a whale by Hans Wellen back over 50 years ago has helped us improve the care of patients with common arrhythmias. Now, I spent some time in Australia and I met another crazy guy, this bloke called Barry Marshall, who explained to his colleagues many years ago that he thought ulcers were caused by infections, not by stress. They promptly threw him out of the lab, and then 4 years later, he came back with a Nobel Prize and they let him back in. And he, of course, discovered H. pylori. His dad was a cow farmer, actually, and that's how he initially thought these weird spirochetes were related to ulcer disease. His dad knew all about them. He said, oh yeah, we always see this in cows. But he's now gone on in a new field of research looking at things related to the microbiome. Where he works in Western Australia doesn't have any native koalas. They were introduced on purpose back about 50, 100 years ago. And initially they all died, actually. People thought they all died of chlamydia, because chlamydia is a big issue in koalas. But they actually died because they couldn't digest the local eucalyptus. And the reason they couldn't digest it is because of their microbiome. But park keepers knew exactly what to do. They imported the feces from koalas in an area with similar eucalyptus, fed it to the pups, and they all survived. And in fact, koalas, like this video show, routinely eat their mother's feces immediately after birth. And we now know the impact of being born OP versus OA, for example, the impact of cesarean section, mainly because of autofecal transplant shortly after birth. And now, of course, it's being used in conditions we may see, as far as C. diff, even to autoimmune disease. And it's not just the koala that can teach us crazy things in Australia. The kangaroo has 3 vaginas. It's another fact for the day for you to talk about over a beer. And the reason it has 3 vaginas is so that it can propagate this prolonged cycle of birth of newborn. And in fact, that can help, it has helped developed the specialty of IVF. The first IVF baby, Louise Brown, was born partially because we now understand the implantation in marsupials, which was always the tricky bit in IVF. It wasn't the fertilization, it was the implantation section. These are actually natural triplets from our good friends back in Wales, and they were all born very premature. And one reason they survived was due to what's called kangaroo care. but what should probably be called primate care. In other words, skin-to-skin contact with mum, with dad, with others, has been shown to produce higher levels of opioids than we sometimes give in PICU, and it's all related to primate grooming. I interviewed a famous anthropologist called Robin Dunbar, who developed Dunbar's number, the number of connections humans can maintain, which is around 150. And it's all actually based on grooming. You know, the reason we can only maintain those connections is because that's the number of people we can physically groom when we were primates. And he's shown that light touch at about 1.5 meters per second produces high levels of opioids, i.e. grooming. He's also shown those same receptors are in your inner ear, which responds to low rhythmic sounds, things like chanting, mantras, things that mothers naturally do with babies when they're born in terms of rocking. And these are all related to exactly the same receptors. And it's partially thanks to that. This is my friend Lucy and her youngest Joe, who was born at just 25 weeks. It's partially thanks to those things that they survived, actually. But it's not just about physiology, it's also about some of the psychological aspects. Death is a common companion in ICU. As many as 1 in 5 patients may die. We should be amazing at death. We should be as good as death as we are as lines, POCUS, and echo. It shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be a major part, a bread and butter of our life. This is a photo of a chimp called Dorothy, who died of natural causes in Cameroon. And as she was being wheeled out to be buried, something very strange happened. All of the group gathered around. They all became completely silent, which is really odd for chimps. They all held each other. They all put their hands through the chain-link fence towards Dorothy. They all held a funeral. And it's been shown that gatherings, cultural gatherings in this manner, especially with others, can help reduce abnormal grief reactions. They can help reduce things like PTSD. And chimps have known this for a long time. We've only relearnt it since people sadly died alone in COVID, but we now know how important those things are. Now, I wish I could say Ivan could be here today. He had a tough time. We spent many hours talking to his parents about how ill he was. He had all of the complications of critical care, and he can't be here today, but he has sent us this message.
Zermatt, I'm Ivan Owens. It's now almost been 5 years since I was put into a coma for 28 days. It's been a very long recovery. Physically, I'm nearly back to how I was before the attack, although I still tire very easily off doing almost nothing. Good news is, I'm back playing football. I play football for my local Welsh-speaking team, Club Cymric, but I'm not allowed to head the ball and I have to wear this padded headband instead. When I woke up from the coma, my first language, Cymraeg, has been and still is very strong. But my English language, well, I still struggle with it today, as you can probably see. But last year, I joined a male choir, Bechyn Brotaf, and we sing in all these different languages. I can't even say which ones. But we also had the incredible experience to sing here in the Millennium Stadium. Because of my brain injury, I'm allowed to use a copy of the words and the music to sing in a competition like here. But my conductor doesn't let me. Guess who won the cup? Over lockdown, I started a clothing company, and by now it's me and my brother that runs the company. 5% of our profits goes to ICU in Heath Hospital, and I'm going to deliver this order. I am now midway through an apprenticeship for Bilingual Cardiff Council, and this is where I work. Thank you very much, Matt, Morgan, and all the staff and all the people that have helped me out as well. I cannot thank you enough. Yes, I do have my physical and mental scars, and also since the injury, I am now epileptic. But that makes us both epileptic, doesn't it, Max? Yeah.
So in summary, when we see things like this in terms of animals, the gamekeepers in Kenya, which was mentioned earlier, they know how to transport animals safely. They routinely transport rhinos prone, upside down, because it helps oxygen levels. And there we were suddenly turning people over in COVID. This is not new knowledge, and we need to work together to know it. And the bizarre thing is, this isn't new. This is one of the oldest cave paintings in the world from Spain. It's a woolly mammoth. And the amazing thing about this is it's correct. The proportions are correct. The location of the heart is correct. The anatomy is correct. We used to understand animals. We didn't used to meet them as a layer in our sandwich. We used to live amongst them. Yes, we still used to kill them and eat them, but we understood their lives as well as their deaths. And I think there is, although the book is full of stories and science and some humor, there are kind of 3 lessons I'd love you to think about and to take away. And that is, why are we training vets and doctors separately? Why aren't we training them together? Why are the departments of medicine and the departments of zoonotic science separate departments? Why aren't they together? We now know more than ever the interaction between antibiotic resistance, pandemic disease, than ever before. Why don't we bring those together? And finally, we swear an oath to one species on the planet, and vets swear an oath to every other species on the planet. It's very odd. So hopefully, through some of those messaging, and we are starting to train vets and doctors together in some universities in Wales as a result, hopefully that will help us develop this concept, which is called One Medicine. Thank you for listening.
That was amazing. Any questions from the audience?
Thanks, Matt. That was a great talk. I'm not sure if it's a question or just a statement. It's interesting that all those learnings that you talked about from animals, all those were gleaned without being cruel to animals. Whereas most, I think, of what we learn from them is by doing experiments and giving them medications and stuff. So it's interesting that it doesn't have to be like that.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess the question was, a lot of the things I talked about didn't involve death or animal experimentation. I guess the reason I got interested in this at all, the first line of the book says, it all started when Barry choked on a hobnob. Hobnob is an oat biscuit, for those who don't know. And what I kind of realized, there was a patient who aspirated on biscuits, not hobnobs. I had to change it for confidentiality. But it made me realize, as humans in ICU, we survive at the extremes, and that's unusual for us. But there are animals living at those extremes all of the time. But they live at those extremes in life, not in death. And so if you want to understand them, you probably need to study them in life. Like the griffin can fly at 40,000 feet with no high flow and no ECMO and no oxygen. You know, how can it do that? And you only understand that when you see them in life, not in death, really. Yeah. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much. That was incredibly interesting. And I think I'll probably be ordering that book on Amazon when I get home.